Well, she's back, folks. Kristen Carder, host of I Have ADHD. Welcome. Welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about how you felt when you came on the last. How did I even get you to like open up? I don't even remember, like, did we talk about this before? Did I just really get you to go? And I just used my special powers of getting people to open up.
You really did. And I innocently was like, I'm coming on the podcast to talk about ADHD. And then all of the sudden am bearing my soul in ways that I think I was pretty self-protective, and I did hold back in a good way. You know, I wasn't quite ready to be sharing things. But I got off of that interview thinking, oh my word, what just happened? What just happened? So I'm very glad to be back a year later, maybe over a year later, just really
a little over a year. So, okay. So let's backtrack. Like right when we recorded, like this was all like very fresh as far as like seeing your family for what it was. Like how fresh was this? Can we like take us back in time as to like where you were then?
So the process for me was several years long, but about 2 weeks prior to recording this episode was when I had finally made the decision. I can't do this anymore. Nothing is changing. Nothing is changing or will ever change.
With your parents, just so people are clear.
Yes, with my parents specifically. And it had gotten to the point where I was enacting boundaries and setting boundaries, and I had already gone like no contact for a little while. And you know the drill. It's everybody's. I feel like when I hear people's story, I'm like, oh yeah, that's exactly how it goes. So if you know, you know. But it had gotten to the point where they were like reaching out to my kids in ways that I didn't like, and that to me was like, okay, this is where we're drawing the line. And so, yeah, it was about 2 weeks prior that I had just like finally sent that no contact letter and really had made like the final decision of like, we're done here, which is so devastating.
Yeah. It's like, because it represents so much more. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's such a long time coming. Yes. And you work so freaking hard to try to avoid it. And, you know, I tried to contort myself in so many different ways. And I spent thousands of dollars on therapy with multiple therapists trying to get someone to tell me that I was the problem. Please tell me that I am the problem so that, because I know how to fix me. I know how to change me. I know how to contort myself. I know how to change. So could somebody just tell me that I'm the problem? And I saw 4 different therapists trying to get someone to tell me that I was the problem.
Well, let's unpack that. Cause like, what did that look like? And like, when was the realization that that's what you were doing? And I'm curious, like, at what point did you, like end a relationship like with one therapist and be like, nope, they're not giving me what I want. And then like move on to like, what did that look like?
So it looks like I have a long-term relationship with my original first therapist. I was so lucky. In 2018, I went to a therapist. Her name is Sharon. God bless Sharon.
Hi, Sharon.
Went to her for the first time, and she told me that I was traumatized, and I got offended and left and was like, get out of here. What are you talking about? I don't have any trauma.
You, Sharon.
And 3 years later, I went back and was like, Sharon,
you're right.
So I still have a relationship with her and I'm still in therapy with her, but I hired people more on like a consultation basis outside of my relationship with Sharon, because at some point, and I don't know, like for anyone who's been through this with toxic family systems or narcissistic family systems, where you're just uncovering how toxic it really is. I then turned on my therapist. So I turned on Sharon. I was like, you're the narcissist. You're the problem here. You're the one you're just trying to get me not to like my parents. And she was like, totally fair. I totally hear you. I totally understand. And so with her blessing.
You actually said that to her.
Yeah, she was like, I totally
Wow.
understand what you're saying. She said, sometimes I think about that. Like, I wonder if you think that maybe I'm like trying to turn you against your parents. And that was so validating to hear. First of all, she thinks about me. First of all,
Yes, absolutely.
right?
That's what, yeah, we always want to be the favorite, right?
I mean, if anybody goes to therapy, you're just like, oh my gosh, you think about me?
That's my number one priority is like
Oh my
not to
gosh.
like be
Like,
told I'm the problem, not to get well, but just to be the favorite. Let's be honest, folks.
yes, to make her laugh and
Hmm.
for her to think that I'm funny and for her to think about me outside of the therapeutic office space, I am winning. So
Hmm.
she just validated it and was like, absolutely, I totally understand. And so I sought out three different therapists. One was no, they were all therapists. One was like acting as a coach, but she had been trained as a therapist. And all of them specialized in children of narcissistic parents. And I just went to them and was like, this isn't really it, right? And all of them, yeah, were like, honey, you're not the problem. And I was like, I hate you. I'm so mad at you. It takes a while to make that shift because when you are
Mm.
groomed and brought up to believe that your parents are God's gift to mankind,
Mhm.
um, it
Mm.
takes a long time to unravel that. Um, what is his
Mm.
name? He wrote Healing the Shame That Binds You, John
John
Bradshaw.
Bradshaw.
Yeah.
Hmm.
He calls it the fantasy bond. And I
Hmm.
will tell you, I was fantasy bonded AF. Like I was the most fantasy bonded person. So essentially, when there is toxicity and abuse in a parent-child relationship, the child will bond to the parent through a fantasy of their own. So not because of a true connection, but because of a fantasy. And I had to keep that fantasy alive in order to stay connected. And I
Stay alive.
desperately wanted to stay connected. Yes,
Mm.
absolutely. It meant the most to me for 4 decades. For
Mm.
4 decades, I was fantasy bonded, and cutting that bond and the toxic hope and all of that. That took 3 years.
Yeah, it's interesting too because it's smashing that is there is the illusion of control,
Mhm.
right? As far as like thinking that we're the problem, but actually it's like the opposite, right? Like we don't really have any control if we're like letting go of that is what allows us to not really control the situation, but
Mhm.
like
Like take
be
matters into our own
yes,
hands.
be active participants and
Exactly.
yes, and
Yeah,
not
and
just along for the
it is
ride.
such a like a counterintuitive thing because you think
Mhm.
like if I can be fantasy bonded, which of course is unconscious, and if I can control me and if I can just change me and tweak me, and if I can try hard enough, then I can make them love me, or then I can make them accept me, or then I can make this relationship healthy enough for me to remain in. But it's actually letting go of that and sacrificing that at the altar of the fantasy bond, really, where you're able to then be autonomous, to then make decisions for yourself, to then truly protect yourself, to then put yourself in a scenario where you're healthy and safe.
Mm. What do you think about as far as beliefs that you held um about yourself that you had to let go of or consider weren't necessarily true as a result of doing so? And it's really interesting how like I mean these can be negative and faulty beliefs, right? But like there is a sense of safety and
Mhm.
comfort and familiarity in some of these beliefs that we held. So I'm wondering like not only is it a matter of coming to terms with who your parents actually are, but I'm curious about what that was like as far as coming to terms with who you are.
Mm. The first ones that come to mind are centered around the belief of being too dramatic,
Mm.
being too sensitive, being
Mhm.
too much. And this idea that my perception of reality is not correct. I was gaslit so severely that I really struggled to understand reality. And I would always need outside validation of like, am I being weird here? Am I the problem here? What's going on here? And it's only in the last couple months
Mm.
actually that I really feel this groundedness in like,
Mm.
excuse me, no, I know what reality is. I know that I am not being too much here. But that takes a long time because when you are so convinced that you are dramatic, that you are too much, that you're too emotional and too sensitive, then you see, of course, it's so convenient for the toxic family system because then everything that happens, you get to say, well, I know I'm being too dramatic, or I know that this is my stuff. That was a big thing. Like, you got to take responsibility for your stuff, which is just the irony of it is out of this world. And
Mm.
so the responsibility to handle my own emotions when being abused, neglected, and mistreated was just like, well, this is my stuff, so I need to handle it. And then learning, no, 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 no. There's accountability to be had in relationships, and you deserve to be treated with kindness and respect and mutuality and reciprocity. And and you should have the ability to be autonomous and make your own
Mm.
decisions without scrutiny and punishment. That was all new concepts. And I'm saying this as someone who is in a very relatively healthy marriage. So
Yeah,
it
how the
was,
hell did that happen?
I think it was just divine
Luck.
intervention.
Screw
Honestly.
you.
Now, when we got married, he's changed a lot in 20 years. We've
Mhm.
been married for 20 years. And he's changed a lot. I've changed a lot. We've both evolved. So I would say when we were dating and newly married, he was as emotionally unavailable as I needed him to be in order
Mhm.
to connect with him.
Mhm.
Right. Because if he was emotionally available, there is no way that
Mm.
I would have been able to connect with him in that state. And I was young, I was a
Mhm.
baby. We were married when I was 23. So we started dating when I was 21. So he was as emotionally unavailable as I needed him to be, and has grown into being an emotionally available, safe, yada, yada, yada. Great. Good for me, whatever. But having the contrast of how I felt in my marriage versus how I felt in my family system was important because it really did show me the difference between the two, how my body felt at home with my husband and my kids versus how I felt in my parents' home. There was a stark contrast. And that eventually became really important information for me.
Was there any connection between because at what point, when did you start your podcast?
Very end of 2018,
When did you get
begin.
your ADHD diagnosis?
I was 21. It
Okay,
was
you were
in
young.
the
Okay.
early 2000s.
When was it that you started to learn about the connection with trauma and ADHD? When was that?
That's such a great question. So I would say around 2019, things started to come up
Yep.
about trauma and ADHD. And I always identified as someone who had never experienced
Yep.
trauma.
Yep.
So when the conversations would come up, I would be very dismissive of it because, like, well, that's great, but I've never experienced trauma. So it doesn't apply to me. Ironically, now transitioning to someone who identifies as highly traumatized, having learned that trauma is not like one big event, but lots of little things that can happen over time and no soft place to land. And for me, there was no soft place to land. Neither parent was safe. And I was very isolated from family. My parents were missionaries in the island of Guam. I, I was homeschooled. The amount of isolation is staggering. And so now being able to look back and see that trauma was a huge impact on my life, that didn't really happen until I was sitting face to face with my therapist. And she just started, I would tell a story and she would say, well, that's trauma. And I would be like, what? No, that's not a big deal. And then I would tell another story and she would say, well, that's trauma. And it was just over and over and over of having my story heard and validated, and also the look of horror on her face as I shared it. Right. So you share a story and it's just your life. this is just normal. This is just how I grew up. This was just not a big deal. And then to have a mirror, have someone looking back at you who is horrified, that changes you. That changes a
Mm-hmm.
person. And so I had to first engage with my own trauma before I could acknowledge that, like, across the board, trauma really is, especially systemic trauma, as far as like being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. So I go to school and I'm neurodivergent in a system that is built for neurotypical people. So even if you come from a wonderful family, you're still experiencing that systemic trauma of, you know, having a brain that's not built for the systems that you're operating in.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. And I know that you're still, unpacking all of this, and it's not something that you've dug into super heavily on your own podcast, which makes sense because I still think it's so fresh. But I personally think that, like, this is like a large part of like what I don't know. I just think that you're supposed to be
Mm,
reaching an audience as it relates to this stuff. I just think the way that it unfolded for you,
mm.
I just see this as being like, part of an important message that you're supposed to spread.
I really appreciate that. I will say, within the safety of my own program,
Mm-hmm.
I use air quotes because, like, there are hundreds of people in that program, but still,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very safe environment where I attract my people,
Yeah.
and it feels really safe. And so within that environment, I speak freely, and I do feel a very strong calling to talk open and honestly about how our families can impact our lives, how our families can impact our nervous systems, how hypervigilance is not just an ADHD thing. It can also be a trauma thing. And
Mm-hmm.
all, like, that conversation. Yeah, I'm much more willing to have right now in the privacy of my own. Privacy is hysterical to say because there's a lot of people there, but in the privacy of my own program. But I'm getting there on my podcast. I just
So
think
it's
that
new. I mean, I
it's
think you're
new.
still making sense of everything, but I
And I
just think
want
that
to
the way it
speak.
unfolded for you, it's not by
Yeah.
mistake.
Yeah. I want to make sure that I'm speaking from the scar and not the wound, and make
Mm-hmm.
sure that, you know, as I'm talking to my own people, that it's not coming from a place of woundedness or a need to, like, I don't know. I don't know. And maybe that's some of the, like, you're dramatic, you're too sensitive, you're all of that. I don't know. But right now I'm pretty
It's
protective, but hey, I'll
new.
share my guts here.
Hmm.
Obviously.
How is it, through coming to terms with this, how has it changed your relationship with your ADHD? And are there
Mm,
any things that, like, you think are, um, hmm, like, what you view to be as like symptoms uh of your ADHD or related to your ADHD that you've now been able to, I don't know, come at from a different angle
mm.
or like tackle in a way that you haven't before? Like, I'm just curious how this is the impact to your, like, quote unquote relationship or recovery with ADHD. I don't know if I want to say
Yeah, it's an
recovery, but you know what I
excellent
mean.
question. I'm so glad you asked, because I think that as we are understanding ADHD, and depending on when you got a diagnosis and where you are in your journey, there's this level of acceptance that really needs to be embraced. And
Mm,
for me, there was level number one, which was like, accept the diagnosis, accept what this means about me. All of these traits that I just thought were character flaws, all of the
mm,
things that I hated about myself, oh, they're actually connected to ADHD. So it's a huge relief. And then how do I set my life up to be able to handle this? So how am I going to treat it? How am I going to accommodate myself?
mm,
But then there's this inner critic. Once we've kind of triaged all of that,
mhm,
there's this really bitchy inner critic that I think most ADHDers have, but especially those of us who are highly traumatized. And there's research, obviously, you've read all of the
mhm,
things on this, but I'm rereading Pete Walker's book right now. And it just talks so much about the inner critic and it being a result of complex trauma. And I will raise my hand and say, that is a huge part of my ADHD that I now attribute to
Mm.
trauma rather than to ADHD. Because if I lived in an environment that helped me to view my symptoms as normal for someone with
Mm.
ADHD, as not a problem, hey, this is just something that you're dealing with, but we're gonna figure it out. If I had a parent that was protecting me instead of shaming me, I would not have the inner critic that I do. And it wasn't until I did, so much work in therapy that I was able to really connect with this protective part of me who just wants to keep me perfect and safe, and really be able to tame that critic. And so for me, that is the most transformative part. And that's the part where I tread very lightly with my clients because obviously I'm a coach, but not a therapist. But even
Mhm.
as a coach, I can point out that the sky is blue and I can point out that the grass is green. And I can encourage you, like, hey, if the sky is blue and the grass is green, you might want to go talk to a therapist about this and really engage in a therapeutic relationship. But that inner critic, I would say, is like the one aspect that I no longer attribute to ADHD, but I attribute to trauma. I
It's so
forget your
interesting
other
when I think about
question.
it. It's kind of like it's similar to like with alcoholism, like in a
Mm,
way. Like
mm,
it's as far as like, you get a diagnosis or you've kind of figure out what's wrong with you and you're kind of treating that. But then it's like, are you really getting to the core? It's like you're kind of treating symptoms.
yes.
Because it's almost like it's like how I now view my alcoholism as a symptom
Yep.
of my complex trauma. And it's like,
Yep.
is your ADHD like a and how far can one really go? And I'm also curious too, because like with me and what I think is so common for people in addiction recovery is like hitting this subsequent like bottom. And I'm curious if like similar stuff like that happens with people too, like in their ADHD journey, as far as like at a certain point, do they like hit a wall?
Hmm. I don't have a personal story or example of that, but I have heard from clients, many clients who have said, like, there's this initial high
Mm,
of, I have a diagnosis, I have an answer, I have a solution, I have a step
mhm,
by step process. Yay. And they follow all the steps, and everything is great for a while as they're like
mhm.
tweaking things and treating their ADHD. And I think for those clients who are highly traumatized, that can only take you so far,
Yeah, yeah.
right? We're treating the symptoms, but like even if you learn how to emotionally regulate, um, you don't understand emotional flashbacks
Mhm.
unless you are connected to your trauma. And so for those clients who are highly traumatized, there's a difference between emotional regulation and learning how to name and soothe and process your emotions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, having an actual emotional flashback to when you're 8 years old and you're completely abandoned, except you're 43 and you're standing in your kitchen and you're like, I'm totally safe. And that is not an emotional regulation conversation. That's an emotional flashback conversation. So I do think that for those ADHDers who are highly traumatized, many of them don't know it yet, right? Which is part of my work is just naming what trauma is. And when we have conversations, sometimes the conversation is pretty short because what I will say is like, honey, I don't have any coaching for you. It sounds like you're in a trauma response right now. So I just want to like
Mm.
give you a hug and help you to regulate and self-soothe. And what what support can you set up for yourself? Right? How can I help you to find a therapist who can work through that with you? Because an emotional flashback is so intense. And for those of us with complex PTSD, we're going to have those frequently.
There's probably not an answer to this, but I'm curious if you've noticed um symptoms manifesting in a different way for those who have more trauma.
I would say they're heightened. Everything is
Mm.
heightened, and the critic is heightened, and there's so much more shame. So maybe the
Mm.
symptoms are not as like more pronounced necessarily. So ADHD is obviously a spectrum disorder. Some of us are more highly symptomatic in areas than others. But the shame connected to the symptoms for those who are highly traumatized is just
Next
off
level.
the charts, off the charts, off the charts. We talk about shame constantly in my program because it's actually the shame that's more debilitating than the symptoms. Like symptoms are annoying. I will be the first to raise my hand and be like, ADHD is annoying and it works against me in a lot of areas of my life. But when I was also experiencing massive amounts of shame, that's what was debilitating because I could not persist within the symptom because the shame was keeping me paralyzed. The shame is what brought me into a spiral. The shame is what made it. So I was like, I don't deserve to try. Nobody's going to listen to me. I'm the worst. I'm the worst. I'm the worst. Therefore, I cannot take steps forward. I cannot persist because the shame is like this
So
ball and
debilitating.
chain. Yep, it's debilitating. And so when I have a client who is symptomatic of ADHD, of course, no problem. We're going to work through that. But when they are bound by shame, that's a different conversation. Then we have to have deeper conversations and unpick and unravel. And that takes longer. And that's, of course it does. Of course it does.
Okay, so one thing that I wanted to talk with you about that's very relevant for me, and I've seen that you've just done a couple episodes on like self-trust.
Mhm.
One thing, and I guess this is kind of related, but I'm curious what your experience is with this personally and your experience with working with other people is, something that I struggle with is like when we, are like setting ourselves up for failure in the sense of like, before we even start doing something, we just know it's going to be so hard and that we're not going to get anywhere and just like setting yourself up like for failure when you're expecting to fail before you even
Mm.
start doing something. And it's not even necessarily like reality, you know?
Yeah.
But what is your experience with that or in helping others, tackle that?
It's such a broad conversation because
I guess it does
self-trust,
kind of play into like the self-trust too aspect of it.
I think so. And, we've, as ADHDers, we've collected volumes of evidence that we can't trust ourselves. We just, like, we can point to 700 examples of like, I said I was going to do this and then I didn't follow through. And I made this commitment to myself and I didn't follow through. And I mean, over and over and over and over. So, how do you help someone who has evidence that they can't
Mm.
trust themselves? How do you help them to shift into someone who can trust themselves? I think the first part to recognize is that self-trust is a developmental process that if you're not someone who trusts yourself, that's not your fault. That
Mm.
was a developmental process that should have taken place, but didn't. If your needs are seen and validated and met in childhood, if you are taken through this process of just this normal process of being seen, heard, validated, you begin to develop self trust. That is a normal, natural developmental milestone. What I really want people to understand off the bat is that if you don't have self trust, it's not because of all of the evidence that you've collected that you can't trust
Mhm.
yourself. It's because that developmental milestone was never completed in your childhood. And that's so important to know. And that also really hurts. And nobody wants to hear that because nobody wants to blame anybody for anything. So we just want to blame ourselves instead of placing blame. And I mean healthy blame,
I think it's
accountability.
kind of relieving, for me personally.
I mean, same, but you would be shocked at the resistance that I get
Yes, I know.
because it hurts. It's just so
Mhm.
painful to acknowledge that that need was not met. So self-trust is built when someone says, I have this need, and the parent says, yes, you do have that need. Let's go meet that need for you. Let me take care of that need for you. Or here's how you can meet that for yourself. Self trust is depleted or never developed when a child says, I have this need, and the parent says, no, you don't. Come on. This is ridiculous. Why are you so dramatic? What are you complaining about? Don't stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Life's tough, kid. It gets worse. Okay. Like, I don't know what you're complaining. And then you start to think, oh, okay, I guess I don't know what's right. I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what I need. Okay. So if that's the foundation, then of course we're going to have all this evidence that we can't trust ourselves. So the first thing that I always want to do is define self-trust. Self-trust is not, I know I'm going to make the right decision all the time. That's what my clients think it is. Like, help me to trust myself. I want to believe that I'm going to make the right decisions all the time. I want to believe that this is going to work out. I want to, like, no, that's not what self-trust is. Self-trust is no matter what happens, I know I can take care of it. No matter what happens, I know I'm going to get through it. No matter what happens, I'm going to figure this out. That's what self-trust is. No matter what happens, I'm going to believe myself. I believe me. I trust that this need is valid. I trust that this is my desire and it matters. I believe me. And so I think that those two things, first of all, defining what self-trust is and making sure that it's not like, because people say like, well, this decision didn't work out, so I can't trust myself. It's like, no, all humans go through experiences where the decision does not work out. But that doesn't mean you can't trust yourself. Did you take care of yourself through that?
Yeah.
Have you persisted through that? I think that shining the light on how much evidence you have that you really can trust yourself, that's so important. You've gotten yourself here. Like, you're listening to this podcast, the adult child podcast on like how to heal from all of the stuff that happened to you. You can trust yourself. Look at you taking care of yourself.
Yeah, and how much of it is self-trust is it's teaching ourselves that we're not going to abandon ourselves. I guess largely what it's rooted in.
And for those of us who grew up in families where you had no choice but to self-abandon in order to stay connected and safe, that reconnection to self is such a long, arduous, but important process. And part of that process is, hey, I got you. I'm not going to let you fall. Even if it doesn't work out, I'm going to take care of us. I'm going to figure it out. That is what self-trust is. It's the connection to self and the commitment to having your own back no matter what.
So can we talk about building self-trust as it relates to task management, procrastination, time efficiency? How the hell do we start building that trust?
What's hard about that is that those are areas that we suck at.
Yeah.
And so for me, and what I teach my clients is in those areas that we know we suck. Self-trust isn't, oh my gosh, I'm going to do an amazing job and I'm going to get this right. And I trust myself to make a list and cross everything off and get it right. No. Here's what self-trust looks like. It looks like, I know that this is something that I'm going to procrastinate on. So I'm going to do everything I can to mitigate that. I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to break everything down into bite-sized steps. I'm going to set up reward systems for myself because my dopamine reward system is broke. And so I need to make sure that I have like little rewards along the way. I'm going to ask for help. Hear me. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to ask for help. Okay. Because I trust that I'm going to set myself up to get this done. And I know that this is a weak area for me. So I'm going to ask for help. So self-trust, let's just say in like time management, I know that I will never remember anything unless it's on my calendar. So self-trust for me looks like pause. I'm going to put it on my calendar. Not, oh, I trust myself to remember it, but I know I will forget it. So I'm going to take the time to put it on my calendar and set a reminder. That's what self-trust looks like. So it's this paradigm shift of like, it's not that I trust myself that everything I'm going to do everything perfectly. It's, I know these are areas that I struggle with. I deserve help. I trust myself to take the necessary steps to make sure I'm supporting myself enough. When an ADHD person is supported, they succeed. If you are not succeeding, it's because you don't have enough support. So, what support do we need to add in for you? Can you trust yourself to validate your need for support and follow through on getting it for you?
Can you walk me through? It could be recent or it could be something that was like the most significant. Like, what was something that you procrastinated on for like, I mean, I would love to even hear something that, like, I just did something that I had been procrastinating on for like over a year, folks. Let's talk about this. I just did it. I'm very proud of myself. It's like, what the fuck? Um, I just needed to input in my episodes, and great, I still need to do it for a chunk, but I did it for like the first half. I needed to put in my episodes in the very beginning before I even started my Patreon. I needed to like put something in there like, hey, since this has been recorded, I started a community. Like, this is where you can find it. So I did that. And then now I just need to add another one that's for once I started the Patreon to be like, hey, since I started the Patreon, I'm now on this thing. But it's like, it literally takes 5 minutes. It's been on my fucking to-do list for a year and a half. Like it's baffling. But compassion, self-compassion, not beating myself up, but I would love to hear about something that was like, yeah, something that was like a real struggle
Yeah.
for you and how you tackled it.
I will for sure. I will for sure share. But first, it's not baffling.
No, I know. I know.
It makes so
It
much
is and it
sense.
isn't.
It's like, it's not really necessary. Your podcast is thriving without it. It's not, there's no one's dying because it's not on there.
Oh, but it's a way that it's something simple that could, result in me becoming more financially independent. So it's
But it also makes sense. Like when we procrastinate, it makes sense. And so
no, I
what
understand why I do it,
exactly, that's the thing. So
but
it's
there's the
not,
baffling part of it too. There is, it's both. It's like the rational part of I understand like why,
Mhm.
but at the same
Yeah.
time, it is kind of
It
baffling.
can be frustrating.
Yes.
It can
Frustrating
be,
is probably the better word,
I
not
think it's
baffling.
frustrating.
It is
And when we're frustrated, we're fighting against reality.
very
Like the
much.
reality of like, why is this so hard? This shouldn't be so hard. I should just be able to do this. And it's like, I just always want to come at that with like, no, this is like the hardest thing ever. The simple, easy, mundane, dumb, un like nobody's dying tasks. Those are so hard.
Yeah, it's deep, it has deep roots, like anything
Mm.
related to like money generation, becoming more financial. It's
Mm.
not like it seems like a simple task, but it has deep roots. So I understand why
Yes.
I understand why I do it, but
Yes, it's so good. Okay, so a recent example of this for me is my license was expired for like a year and a half.
driver's license.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of went through that too. I mean, wasn't expired, but my car registration, I just did it. And I finally just went and got my Florida driver's license, and I'd been here for a while, so I just did this too. But go ahead. Love
Oh,
hearing
it's
this. Love
so
hearing this shit.
good. It was to the point where I had to use my passport to
You get
buy
in the car?
wine.
Do you freak out when you're in the car?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Me too.
And you can't buy alcohol. And at the time, like I'm 6 months sober-ish now, but at the time I was drinking quite a bit. And so I was using my passport to purchase alcohol because my license was expired. I finally got myself to the DMV and timed it because I knew like I'm finally here. I've been putting it off forever. How long is this going to take? I wonder how long it's going to take.
20
7 minutes.
Yeah.
7 minutes. It took 7 minutes to get it renewed and like it was fine. And I just was like, gosh, all of that drama, all of that like mental load, emotional load of
The negative
procrastination.
excitement.
Uh-huh. And it took 7 minutes. And I have a lot of things like that. I'm not as symptomatic in that way anymore. And I ask my husband for a ton of help. So the things
Mhm.
like making a return or like things that I would really procrastinate on, I am now at the point where I'm just like, bills. Oh my gosh. I went into collection for like a stupid bill that I just like forgot about, missed. So
Mhm.
now those things I'm just like, honey, I like, this is not going to be the thing that I do. And so I just ask him. And like, gosh, I have a supportive partner. Most people don't. Most people don't have a supportive partner. Most people's partners shame them, blame them, judge them. And gosh, it makes me angry. But I do have a supportive partner who I can ask for help from, and I appreciate it so much because now, and going back to self-trust, I get one of those little bills in the mail and I'm like, I know I'm not going to care about this $7 bill that now I have to mail a check in for $8 or whatever. So I can give it to my husband and say like, I'm never going to pay this. Can you please pay this? And he'll be like, sure. He doesn't care.
I
I
love that.
know. I'm so
Um,
lucky.
what about, can you talk about if there's any new research or what you're seeing, what you hear in your community as it relates to like what I struggle with so much as far as like phone stuff?
Hmm. Oh my goodness. I don't know that there is any new research out on the phone stuff, but I will say that this is a persistent struggle for many people with ADHD or addictive tendencies. Obviously, more on the addictive tendencies stuff, but for me, and my community, they use all kinds of apps to block them out of um, certain other apps, which is
Mhm.
ironic, like use an app to block yourself from an app. Time limits. I'm dealing with a kiddo right now, my own child, who I think has a pretty intense phone addiction. And
Mhm.
it's really interesting. So now we have screen time limits and we always have, but he's kind of figured a way to like bypass them. And we caught him on camera, like sneaking down in the middle of the night to be on his phone. Like always have had them plug in
Mm.
their phones in the kitchen, but so now he plugs it in our bedroom, and also his Xbox controller comes in our bedroom at night, like things like that. It's just so hard because, again, we have to remember that our dopamine reward system is broken. And so we do not get the correct amount of dopamine for just like the mundane,
Shit that we
annoying,
do. Yeah.
regular tasks of life. And so we crave it. And that can look like, getting it through alcohol, through drugs, through phone, through food, through porn, whatever the case may be. But your body is designed to have it and you're going to go looking for it. And so understanding that that is a big part of what's happening. So for my kiddo, what we're thinking through is, first of all, does his ADHD medication maybe need to be bumped up? He's hit a growth spurt. It hasn't been increased in a year. He's probably gained 25 pounds since then. Like he's really grown a ton. So that might be a factor. And then also like setting him up with other fun things to do. Like, are there
Mm.
other interesting things in your life? Like, is he involved in enough sports? Are we encouraging him to like reach out to friends? Hey, have your friends over. We'll get pizza. Like, are we making it really easy for him to have fun in real life? Because listen, if your real life isn't that fun, you're going to be on your phone a ton, right? Like, set up your life to be more fun. And then, yeah, like having those limits. And sometimes it feels really infantilizing as an adult to put
Mm.
limits on or like
Mhm.
use the apps that I'll hear my clients say, like, I shouldn't have to do this. And y'all, I shouldn't have to. This shouldn't be that hard. It's like, yeah, it should. It should be exactly this hard. This is really, really hard. You should have to do this. And so, how can you be the most supportive to yourself in it?
So there's this one app, like people probably, it's called Freedom,
Mm,
but so this is like what I've had to do. So like you can block apps on there. You can set it up though to like so that you can't undo it. But the
mm,
problem is that you could then go on the website and then undo it on your website. So what I had to do was have a friend change the password to the website so that
So
I don't know
funny.
that. So then I can't get on there then.
Gosh. How does that feel for you? Does that feel like hard, or does that feel like you're being supportive, or what does that feel like?
Yeah, no, it's fine. The problem is
Yeah.
that like sometimes the app doesn't work. It's like the only problem.
The
It's
Freedom
like
app.
there's like I don't know what it is or what causes
Yeah.
it, you know? But there's been, and usually it does, but like there was it was a couple weeks ago where like I had it set to like block at a certain time and for
Mhm.
some reason it didn't. And then my whole day was fucked, you know?
Yep. Yep. And I feel like I'm talking to my son in his 20s, right?
Yeah.
Like I feel like that is probably how he's going to be, is like he's such a smart person and he has a million friends. Like he's the most social person. But I think he gets sucked in a way that even he doesn't want. And
Isn't it like everybody his age? Like that's like what I'm kind of
mm,
curious. I mean, is this not like this
no,
has got to be pretty common, right?
I mean, I'm sure it is common, but as a mom who has mom friends,
Yeah.
I don't see it as much in other
Really?
kids. It's just hard to be like the one.
Do
I
you
feel
think that
like
that's accurate? Do you think that's accurate though?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, what it seems like to me is that other kids are able to be on their screen and then put it down and do something else.
Mm.
And I have created children. The children that have come out of my body will not put down their screens unless I tell them to, or it like a limit comes up.
Hmm.
I will say that my oldest now is more self regulated in this area, and that is beautiful. And it gives me hope for the future. It gives me a lot of hope. So he's 16. And so, yeah, there's some more brain development there. And yeah, I think that he is more regulated, but it's really hard to feel like, of course, it's my kids that blah, 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 you know? But that's just my own mom issues. So that's okay. I'll deal with that.
Are they allowed to bring their phones to school? Like what's the
Yeah.
deal there?
Well, I have a 16, 14, 10. The 10-year-old doesn't have a phone. So we gave them a phone at 12 with no social media. And then they got Instagram at 13, Snapchat at 14. Like we tried to just like delay it as much as possible. So what was the question? Do they bring their phones to school? Yes. Yeah.
Are the schools pretty strict about like
The
making sure
middle
they're off
school
of it?
just finally implemented no phones in the classroom. Finally. So that's wonderful. The high school, it's a pretty much a free for all. They just do whatever.
Hmm.
It depends on the teacher. Like some teachers are like phones away. Some teachers allow phones.
Can you talk about the connection between like what are the struggles related to parenting in
Mhm.
ADHD?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it a lot. I would say that the number one issue that I see is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation as a parent with ADHD who's likely parenting neurodivergent children, right? Because ADHD is so inheritable. It's as heritable as height, which is wild to think about. So if you are a parent with ADHD, you are likely parenting a kid or two or three with ADHD. And so emotional regulation is just this skill that most of us did not grow up with, even people who are not, ADHD. Most of us didn't grow up with the skill of emotional regulation. But then because of ADHD, emotions are just heightened. They're more impulsive. Our
Hmm.
amygdala is so often hijacked. And controlling your own emotions and your own triggers while you're parenting the people who are triggering you the most is just a whole thing. So when I am coaching parents, it is usually on the topic of emotional regulation. And even if we're talking about time management, it is actually usually an underlying emotional regulation issue, which is really interesting.
Explain.
So let's say I have a parent that comes to me and they're like, Everything is chaotic. I can't manage my time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Usually the chaos in the background is an unregulated nervous system. Usually the chaos in the background is kids acting out, needing that co-regulation. And an ADHD parent who has not done the work is not going to be able to co-regulate and help their kiddo to calm down. And so then it just escalates. And all of a sudden I'm screaming at you to get your cleats on because we're late for the soccer game. And the kid is screaming back. And it's just like, that's not actually a time management issue. That's an emotional regulation issue. And if we could just like all calm down. And if I could meet my child where they are, I remember, I have so many memories of shame as I look back on how I parented for my kids' first 10 years of life. And when I have those flashbacks and those memories, I am just overcome with shame, but also gratitude for the repair that I am continuing to make with my kids. But I remembering my middle guy, who was just like mild mannered, the sweetest little guy. And he's crying because he can't get his cleat on. And I remember screaming at him, "Are you actually crying over a cleat?" And like, gosh, that's so mean. And gosh, that's not what he was probably 8. That's not what he needed. The poor sweetheart. So those time management issues are usually connected to our ability to just be cool, stay regulated, not be so chaotic, not be like we're on the spin cycle of the washing machine all the time, and just remain calm as we're getting out the door, as we're doing the things.
Are there any things in particular to keep in mind as it relates to regulating your nervous system that are unique for those that are like neurodivergent?
I think the most important thing that comes to my mind is just understanding how impulsive your emotions are going to be. So while a neurotypical person may not have an emotional reaction to their food coming out wrong at the restaurant, your emotion may be really intense and it's going to be pretty impulsive. It's not going to be something that you're going to be able to control. Like it's just there. And so understanding that that does not make you a bad person, it just means that because you have ADHD, you are impulsive and so are your emotions. And so as you learn to validate and regulate the emotions that come up, a big part of that is just accepting how impulsive they are. And just because the emotion is there doesn't mean that it needs to be acted upon. Like, okay, I'm feeling a big feeling. So now I will say like, wow, I am really feeling a big feeling about this, but I just need a minute to go like calm myself down because I don't think it matches the situation. A lot of times my emotions are going to be outsized pertaining to the situation. And that's just a part of having ADHD. That's not because of anything in me. And then also remembering how much trauma I have and how broken my nervous system is and how it's healing, but how it just was never developed properly. I think that self-acceptance as well. So especially if you come from a highly traumatized environment or like a really toxic environment, being able to recognize that that's really going to play a big part in your emotions. And I had to learn, I just didn't know the basics that like my kids aren't causing my emotions. I thought they were. My kids aren't, their job is not to regulate my emotions. I grew up regulating my parents' emotions. Of course, I parented my kids as if they should be regulating my emotions. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I
Is that how it
gosh,
works?
uh, it's so wild to think that that is how I thought it worked because kids are the worst when it comes to regulating emotions. Like they're so bad at it. And it's just wild to think that I actually did develop the skill of regulating my parents' emotions and was not so bad at it at all. And when you think about the survival skills that you develop as a kiddo, sometimes it's wild to think about.
How is your parenting in the way in which you've shown up for your kids changed just in the last year or so that you've been coming to terms with all this stuff with your parents?
I mean, it's significantly different. And it's been 3.5 years that I've
Yeah.
been doing this work on my parents. So in that amount of time, I would say the most significant shift is just in validating their experience, not invalidating. The most significant shift is in validating their experience and believing them.
Mm.
I believe my kids. When they tell me anything, I believe them,
Mm.
except like, how much time did you spend on the Xbox today? I don't believe anything they say when it comes to that. But when they're having an experience, I believe them. When they are upset, I believe them. When they are stressed out, I believe them. And that's a gift that I've given to myself. I now believe myself, and I will forever believe my kids from now until the day that I die. I believe you. If that's how it happened, I believe you.
Mm.
And that is just made a significant change in our relationship. I remember right around the time that I started doing, I was being coached, but I wasn't in therapy yet. So maybe 2017, 2018. I remember writing in a journal, I don't feel connected to my kids. My goal this year is to feel connected to your kid, to my kids. Imagine being a mom of three and not feeling connected to your children.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know at the time that connecting to my kids would cause me to lose everything in my family of origin because
Mm.
I could not connect to my kids and stay connected to my parents. It was impossible. So I chose the relationship with my children over the relationship with my parents, and I would
Explain
do it
that.
again.
Explain how you couldn't do both. And what was the how did you come to terms with that?
In order to connect to my kids, I had to start believing them. In
Mm.
order to start believing them, I had to start believing
Believing you.
myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
In order to believe myself, I had to acknowledge the reality of the neglect and abuse and isolation and gaslighting that I was subjected to. And I also had to acknowledge that, like, yes, that happened a long time ago, but also the relationship that we have now is not a relationship that I can tolerate. And I had to just believe myself
Mm.
over and over and over. And there was no way for me to stay connected to myself and to my parents. I tried. I tried for 3.5 years. I tried to tweak it. I tried to therapize it. I tried to ask for it. I tried everything. But there was just no way to stay connected to myself and to my parents. The only way that I can connect to my kids is if I'm connected to myself.
Mhm.
So it was like this triangle of like people pulling at me and making a conscious decision of, okay, I can no longer say, well, that's just your Grammy, that's just your pop, that's just how they are. I had to believe my kids about their experience of my parents. I had to believe my kids about about their
Mm.
experience of life, and that meant that I could no longer deny my own experience. So I think that that's really deep, and if you haven't been through that process, it might not connect to you. But because of the severity of what I had experienced, I just could not stay connected to myself and my kids and my parents at the same time.
How have you navigated conversations with them as far as the boundaries that you've set with their grandparents? And how has that looked different based off what age they are? Like, is it because you can,
Mm.
it depends on how old they are and what they can comprehend. And I'm curious if it looks different based off of how old they are.
It's really interesting. I would say the boundaries themselves don't look different based off of how old they are, but the conversations and the depth of conversation does look different. And also, I want to meet my kids with as much vulnerability as they feel comfortable with.
Mm,
So, one
mhm.
of the key factors in my family of origin, my relationship with my parents, was forced vulnerability.
Mm.
And that might
What did that
explain.
look like?
Ugh. It's a question I don't want to answer. It just looked like forced vulnerability. It looked like sharing things that I didn't want to share. It looked like revealing things that I didn't want to reveal and then being punished for what I revealed. It looked like um, a
Like
lot of
Scientology.
yeah, a lot of exploitation
Mhm.
of vulnerabilities. And one of the things that I'm committed to is never forcing vulnerability with my kids, but always meeting them with or matching what they are comfortable with. And so each kiddo has a different tolerance level for conversation around their grandparents, for an understanding, for hearing my story. One of them, I really want to make sure to be
Yeah,
careful
to
to
protect.
protect
Yeah, of
their
course.
anonymity. But one of them wants to hear everything. He's like a little therapist. How did that make you feel, mommy? That must have been so hard for you, mommy. Tell me everything. I want to know more. He
Mhm.
wants to know everything. And so I have
Mhm.
to be really careful not to emotionally parentify him and to not share too much and to just say, like, it is hard, but I'm also being supported and I don't need you to support me, just so you know. Like, I will make sure to tell you age appropriate stuff, but I don't need your support. Um, so another kiddo, we had maybe two or three conversations and he grieved a little bit and then moved right along.
Mhm.
Another kiddo is having like a harder experience. And honestly, when I was going through the process and wanting to talk to the kids about it and kind of explain it, he was not on board with hearing any of it. And so
Mm.
at the time, which was like a year and a half ago, when we were making these decisions and I was like trying to share it with the kids, this child didn't want to talk about it. And so he would just like try to excuse himself for the conversation. I don't want to hear this. And we just let him, okay, you don't have to talk about it. Like, that's fine. So now this summer, he's circling back around and starting to ask those questions. And he's starting the grieving process that the other two went through a year and a half ago, which is a really interesting thing to navigate because he wasn't ready at the time to confront any of it or to feel any of those feelings. Now he's ready, and I just want to be done with it. But I have to like be there and really hold space for that. So those are ongoing conversations that we're having with him.
That's really interesting. It's so, and I know that your sisters have set similar boundaries. It's interesting. Like, are there any grandchildren that are like wanting to like still have a relationship with their grandparents, and how has that
Mhm.
been navigated?
Yes, there are. And
Mhm.
as their parents,
Mhm.
we're pretty united on, if your grandparent can't have a healthy relationship with me, then there's no way that they're going to have a relationship with you.
Mm.
So the relationship that a grandparent has with their grandchild goes through the parent. And if you can have a healthy relationship with the parent, then you get access to the kids. Great. And that's what
Mm.
we all long for. All of us. That's what we would all want, is healthy relationships. But if you're not able to have a healthy relationship with the child, then you do not have the opportunity to have relationship with the grandchildren. And that has been particularly hard for one of the grandkiddos. And they are wanting to reach out, and that is so hard to navigate because um they might be mad at us for the rest of their lives for that.
Mhm.
And uh, that's just something that we're willing to own. And we'll say to them, hey, you have the right to be angry about this, and you might be mad for the rest of your life. And I can handle that. What I can't handle is exposing you to toxicity and abuse that I can't protect you from. That's what I can't handle. I can handle your anger. I'm here for your anger. Be angry. I can handle it. What I can't handle is exposing you to abuse and not being able to protect you from that.
I've had a couple episodes. I've had 2 episodes with siblings. One was like 3 sisters, and then one was, yeah, 2 sisters, 2 brothers. And just how varying everyone's experiences are. Like,
Mhm.
you and your sisters are very united on this front. How much does your perception of what you guys experience differ as far as kids?
Such a great question. I think I talked to you about this when we chatted on my podcast, Patrick Tian's
Mhm.
Toxic
Oh
Family
yeah,
Test.
I still need to look at that. Yeah.
Okay. So Patrick Tian, who I adore,
Mhm.
he's a therapist and he has this toxic family test, which I think is really useful for anyone. In just if you're curious about like, how bad was it really in my family?
Oh, I think you were telling me this. Yeah, that you
Yeah.
guys had very similar answers.
We all three came back with scores in the 90s. So it was
Mm.
like off the charts toxicity. And that was really interesting because, yeah, we're 3 siblings. All 3 of us are neurodivergent. One of my sisters is autistic. All 3 of us have been diagnosed with ADHD. We are 6.5 years apart, so like me and then 3.5 years and then almost 3 more years. And we did have quote unquote different parents in that, like my kids also have different parents, right? It's like you're a different person, but the threads are all the same. Parentification, isolation, gaslighting, emotional neglect, and a lack of protection. All of those threads are the same. It manifested in different areas. Some of us had it harder than others. Some of us were parentified more severely than others, but
Mhm.
those threads run all the way through. And so when we are together, it's beautiful. And we're really different people. But to be able to have that common bond. I know it's really rare. It's so rare to have a whole sibling group be on the same page. And I just feel so grateful for it.
When did your sister get diagnosed with autism? Was that like later in life?
Yeah. Later
Mhm.
in life, definitely. So she was diagnosed, I'm trying to remember, I would probably say 2020, maybe 2021. And yeah, it was probably 2021 actually, because I had somebody, a friend of mine who was ADHD and then she was diagnosed with autism. I had her on my podcast and she was telling me about the symptoms of autism in women. And I was like, oh my gosh,
I need to do an episode about that.
you for
It's not something
sure.
I don't really know much about it, but there's a couple people in my community that, have had late in life diagnoses that I'm
Hmm. Hmm.
curious in learning more about it.
It's a wonderful thing to explore. And so many people are missed. And especially women are
Mhm.
rarely diagnosed properly with autism.
Mhm.
And let me tell you, it explains everything. It explains so much about who she is, about how she interacts with the world, about how she interacts with me as her sister, about how our relationship was really difficult. It was very difficult. And to be able to see it through the lens of a diagnosis of autism rather than putting the blame on her. And
Mm.
she was the scapegoat in a lot of ways of the family, which of course makes sense. It's so awful. And it's so like textbook. It's like a predictive script. But she was the scapegoat for a long time. We took turns in that role as you do in narcissistic family systems, but she was a scapegoat quite a bit. And so instead of her being the problem, we get to look at a diagnosis and plus trauma, and we get to say, oh, so much of this is explained. So much of this makes sense. And there's so much more compassion and empathy and love and care and connection because of that diagnosis.
Hmm.
Yeah,
If you
it's
have any
beautiful.
recommendations of people to talk to, I'm totally open to it. So,
Yeah, that would be great.
mm. You can get back to me. All right. So what do you want to promote? What are you working on? What do you want to talk about? What do you want to push, sell, whatever? You tell me, lady.
I
What are
just
you jazzed about? Anything?
That's a great question. I only sell one thing, and that is my ADHD coaching program. I am always jazzed about it. We have just the most wonderful supportive community, and healing happens in community. And so if you are an ADHDer and you are desperate for community, we got you. It's called Focused. You can go to my website, ihaveadhd.com, but it's not accessible to everyone. And I would just recommend starting with the podcast. I think to have a body of work like the podcast, it's been around since early 2019. I think there's just so much value there. And I've interviewed all of the experts of the ADHD books that are sitting on your shelf collecting dust. And to be able to hear their voices, Russell Barkley, Ned Hallowell, Patricia Quinn, Sari Solden, all those people that have written the books that we read, they're just amazing. And to be able to have that body of work, I just highly recommend that. Like, go do the free thing before you do anything.
I would think that like now with this, like you coming to terms with the trauma stuff too, it's like that opens up like so many more topics and it probably just like makes things a lot more interesting for you too, right?
It does. What I always worry about, and this is just like friend to friend, pretending no one else is
You don't want it
listening.
to get like watered down.
Well, I don't want it to get too deep or too above the heads of people who are just beginning the journey. Do you know what I mean? Like, would I have been able to handle a conversation about trauma 6 years ago? I don't know. And so I do worry, like, I really try to have a balance of like really basic fundamental information and then the deeper work. But in the program, in the focus coaching program, that's where we do a ton of deep work, especially the longer that you're in the program. So if you're a VIP or if you're an A-lister, so like 6 months or a year in, we're doing all kinds of like complex PTSD and trauma work. Yeah, that part's super fun. So I kind of get it out of my system in that area.
That way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I try to keep the podcast pretty fundamental just so that people who are just learning about ADHD are really able to connect with it.
Yeah, I don't know if you've come across her before, but I recently had her on my podcast and she has a book on ADHD. Her name is Dr. Amelia Kelly. You should connect with her. I think you would really like her. She was
What
great.
is her book?
I think she's something that has 88 powers in the title. Like, but I was a big fan.
I love that you were a big fan and you don't remember the title of her book.
Well, I mean, she has other books that we talked about.
Validating to me. That's awesome.
Powered by ADHD, strategies and exercises for women to harness their
Oh, yes.
untapped gifts.
Yep. That's a new book, right?
Kind of new. I think so. Let's see. When did it come out? Yeah, it's new.
Yeah, this year, right?
Yeah, like a couple of months ago.
Like yesterday. It came out yesterday.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yes. When you read the subtitle, I knew I had heard about that. That's cool. Yeah, I'll connect with her.
Yeah, I dug her. Well, thank you so much. I'll put all your shit in the show notes. So
I just really like you, and I'm
thank you.
so
I love
glad
chatting with you
to connect, and I love the work that you're doing. So just thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.